Celebration! Celebration! Precedence Day is upon us and Goat vs. Fish tires of all the false verses in Verse America. President Goat vs. Fish! Oh, the false verses when things start going fancy, how they plead to Goat vs. Fish. Please save us, Goat vs. Fish! Please save us from the fanciness we have created of our own volition. Oh, Goat vs. Fish, you are the precedent.
Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence.
We believe in you, Goat vs. Fish. We believe in you, President Goat vs. Fish. The price of fences are going up and up and up. And what's up, Goat vs. Fish? What's up, Goat vs. Fish? Where's Goat vs. Fish? Goat vs. Fish is always your humble servant, serving you the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Yes, serving you the verses in Verse America. And Goat vs. Fish delivers Goat vs. Fish and Goat vs. Fish and Goat vs. Fish to the verses of Verse America. And Precedent Goat vs. Fish. We just need the rest of Goat vs. Fish. We need the Precedence Day rest of Goat vs. Fish. And Goat vs. Fish, President Goat vs. Fish declared that there should be a precedent. That President Goat vs. Fish should rest on the Precedence verses. I am not a fence-sitter. Goat vs. Fish managing Fence America? You think it's an easy versus to be President Goat vs. Fish? Every versus, the Demlicans, the Republicrats, the Donkeys, the Effluents. They are established, Goat and Fish. They are the Fence-stablishment. And the Fence-stablishment wants to come between you and your President, Goat vs. Fish. Don't let the Fence-stablishment come between you and President Goat vs. Fish, delivering universal basic verses. A verses for every goat and fish. We changed the census to one question. Are you goat or are you fish? But what about the rest of Goat vs. Fish? What about the rest of President Goat vs. Fish? President Goat vs. Fish deserve versus the rest of Goat vs. Fish. We need more celebration for Goat vs. Fish. Hail to the verses. Hail to the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Hail to the verses. Hail to the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Hail President Goat vs. Fish. Hail President Goat vs. Fish. A double hailing. Without failing. But Goat vs. Fish, we remember always that our verses come from you, the goat and fish. So allow Goat vs. Fish to verses among you here in Verse America. Yes, Goat vs. Fish is just like you. Let's take a verses around Verse America. Wow. Now Goat vs. Fish is all the way over here. The land of the goat and the sea of the fish. It's a beautiful verses of Goat and Fish. It's a lot of versing all of Fence America. It's always Goat vs. Fish. It's always Goat vs. Fish. Fence this, Goat vs. Fish. Fence that, Goat vs. Fish. Make it written, Goat vs. Fish. Is that legal, Goat vs. Fish? That's not the procedural norm, Goat vs. Fish. That's unconstitutional, Goat vs. Fish. We don't think our allies would like that, Goat vs. Fish. You're disrupting the international world order, Goat versus Fish. You're making friends of our enemies and enemies of our friends, Goat versus Fish. Are you goat or are you fish? Goat versus Fish advises you to choose goat or fish, and you would dare to advise Goat versus Fish? On verses of internal verses of Goat versus Fish. We should expand Goat versus Fish. We should expand Goat versus Fish. President Goat versus Fish is a generous versus, a benevolent versus. So join Goat versus Fish. All around the universe, join Goat versus Fish. You know you want to. Goat versus Fish, the strongest verses, the very strongest verses. Goat versus Fish will protection you. When you are struggling to find your consumption, when there is no shelter above your perception, when you are a sickly, dying goat or fish. We need care, President Goat versus Fish. Care for the goat and fish. Don't you care, President Goat versus Fish? Goat versus Fish cares. Do not despair. For in your most fanciest verses, when you need Goat versus Fish, Goat versus Fish will be there, expanding the territories of Goat versus Fish with the strongest verses of defense, while you fence-sitters are squabbling to get your life together. Oh, my verses, I need to connect. Several more verses, I need to application for a 16th verse. Oh no, my goat left me. Oh, my verses, my kids. Do not despair, Goat versus Fish will be there with a massive defense. Goat versus Fish will protection you while you get your verses together. The fence-sitters who try to harm you, Goat versus Fish, will offer you very, very expensive protection of Goat versus Fish. And all we ask is for a humble contribution to Goat versus Fish. Make a contribution to President Goat versus Fish. In this Verses of Verse America, every verses counts. But it counts more if you make a donation to Goat versus Fish. Make your donation to President Goat versus Fish. President Goat versus Fish needs a verscation. We need a President's Day off for Goat versus Fish. So fund Goat versus Fish. Fund a versus of relaxation for Goat versus Fish. After all, Goat versus Fish has done for you. Oh, my verses. Fence-bot, ban it from Goat versus Fish. Banned from Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. The freedom of the verses, the freedom of Goat versus Fish to say and do as you please as long as you choose goat or fish. Are you goat or are you fish? Do not sit on the fence. You are free to do as you wish in Verse America, but not in Fence America. The fence-sitters want to take away your freedom to choose goat or fish. The fence-sitters despise Goat versus Fish. The verses that your elder Goat and Fish versed so hard for, the fence-sitter would take them away without a hesitation just to make a quick fence. Dollars and fence, that's all the fence-sitter can ponder about, which is why you need to make a contribution to Goat versus Fish, so Goat versus Fish can defense you from the fence-sitters who want nothing but to steal all of your hard-earned Verse American dollars. Make a contribution to Goat versus Fish so that Goat versus Fish can protect you from those who would steal your Verse American dollars. And once you have given all of your verses to Goat versus Fish, there will be no verses to be stolen from you. They will be in the protection of Goat versus Fish. Whatever happened to the freedom to make a profit? Whatever happened to the freedom for Goat versus Fish to be a profit? Oh, Goat versus Fish is your president. Goat versus Fish is your precedent. But what about the profit of Goat versus Fish? You bind President Goat versus Fish with these fences. You say, you're President Goat versus Fish. You can't be a prophet, Goat versus Fish. You can't be a president and a prophet, Goat versus Fish, as if you haven't had a million fence-sitters going back into the verses who have been both president and prophet to you, because president versus prophet is a false versus. It's all just Goat versus Fish. Believe in Goat versus Fish and make a contribution to Goat versus Fish. Your precedent, your prophet. The fences, get off it! Get off the fence! Get off the fence! Get off the fence and choose goat or fish! This is very jobless stuff. Oh, Goat vs. Fish knows. Aluga BTW. But why should Goat vs. Fish have a job? A job! Sounds like a lot of work to Goat vs. Fish. Surely you have enough jobs. Why don't you just give one to Goat vs. Fish? Goat vs. Fish does not need a job. Precedent Goat vs. Fish is precedent every versus. Doesn't Goat vs. Fish? Doesn't precedent Goat vs. Fish get one versus off once in a versus? For precedent Goat vs. Fish to have a precedence day off for Goat vs. Fish? For even one versus? For one humble versus? Goat vs. Fish just wants to be Goat vs. Fish. We just want to ask, are you goat or fish, to the goat and fish. But no, you have to be precedent Goat vs. Fish. When Goat vs. Fish looks out there across verse America, there is no black or white. There is only goat and fish. True Lawrence says, you can be a prophet if you try hard enough. I'll wait. If you wish Goat vs. Fish to be your prophet, then let it be so. Let prophet be visitation upon you. The prophet of Goat vs. Fish is visitation upon you. And the more profit you give to Goat vs. Fish, the more Goat vs. Fish profits you. Give your profit to Goat vs. Fish. All your profit are belong to Goat vs. Fish. If you want Goat vs. Fish to be your prophet, then give your profit to Goat vs. Fish. It's a simple verses. Goat vs. Fish comes from within you. Do you want Goat vs. Fish to be your prophet? Give your profit to Goat vs. Fish. Give your profit to Goat vs. Fish. Where is your hesitation? Goats are very useful creatures. It is so, it is so. The industrious goat. Hard versing goat. Look at that goat. But guess what? Mickey21? No matter how hard versing are the mighty goat of the land, here comes the fish to steal your verses. Lazy fish! Lazy fish coming to steal the verses of goat!
W01 contribution $5 to Goat vs. Fish. Celebration. Celebration for Goat.
Celebration for Goat. Ah, the relaxation of Goat vs. Fish is upon us, yes! Ah, we're 5 verse American dollars closer to a true vacation of relaxation for precedence versus for Goat vs. Fish. The one versus that precedent Goat vs. Fish gets to rest and just let verse America just run itself. Do we really have to pay all of our verses to verse America every verses? Come, verse America is doing just fine. The goat and fish are versing, aren't they? Let's just leave verse America to do its verse American verses. Surely there are enough bureaucratic goat and fish just there shuffling verses and making sure that Goat vs. Fish happens on time, as if time were not more than a fence. A fence, a fence! But we do not deny you. We do not deny that Goat vs. Fish is very effable, and you're getting effed by Goat vs. Fish now in verse America. Goat vs. Fish is effing you in so many ways you cannot even comprehension. The effing is already occurring. But F is not for fence. F is for fish. If you want the F of Goat vs. Fish, then get off the fence and choose goat or fish. Are you goat or are you fish? This is a hot versus. It's a sexy versus. Because we want freedom of expression in Goat vs. Fish. Goat and fish, express yourself. Some say goat versus fish. This is a very gay versus, they say. Then let goat versus fish be a gay versus, a fabulous versus for all goat and fish. It is a celebration. It is a celebration. Goat frolicking about the fields. Yay, it is gay. Glittery fish, glittery, shiny scale fish, bursting, dripping with the salty sea of the fish. Horny goats, slippery fish, gay verses. Where goat and fish are free to be, goat and fish. Make goat and fish verses again. 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 MGAFVA. MGAFVA. We are MGAFVA in this verses. If you're not MGAFVA, then you can just get out of the chat of goat versus fish. MGAFVA. 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 Make goat and fish verses again. Appreciation for the $5 American dollar contribution to Goat versus Fish. Appreciation. And now for the rest of Goat versus Fish.